Tere pärastlõunast. Alustame siis. Minu nimi on Reet Palis ja olen siis Kultuuriministeeriumi välissuhete osakonna nõunik ja tore on teid tervitada tänasel pärastlõunasel infoseminaril. Tore, et saite ühineda ja ma nüüd lülitan ümber inglise keelele. So welcome everyone. Glad to see you all participating today at this infoseminar. So we have British and Estonian experts here today joining us to tell you what the sector and what we should know about the new rules, how to consider all these rules and regulations when we talk about mobility between Estonia and the UK. And shortly about this time schedule. So we have about 2 hours. Firstly, we have the session about the mobility from Estonia to the UK. And afterwards, we have the mobility from the UK to Estonia. And after each session, we will have a short questions and answers session. And hopefully this will be very useful to you all. And some practical tips also. So to have a better quality of this info seminar, please mute your microphones and also keep your video cameras shut at the moment. And if you have some questions during the presentation, please write them in the chat section. And afterwards, when we have this Q&A session, please raise your hand. And let me also remind you that we will record this info seminar. So afterwards, we will put it also on our homepage, on the Estonian Ministry of Culture homepage, and you can see afterwards as well and distribute. But now I would like to give the word to our British experts joining us today here from the Latitude Law. Please introduce yourself and let's start.
Thank you very much for the introduction. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for having us to join you today. My name is Shara. I'm joined today for this session by my colleague Gary, and we are UK immigration lawyers, and we focus on UK inbound migration to the UK. So we have a presentation for you today, which will be in 2 parts. I will be taking the first part, which is about short-term trips to the UK, and then my colleague Gary will take over for the second part of our presentation, which looks at some longer-term options, which include sponsorship as well for relocation to the UK. So I hope that everybody can now see the slides. Please let me know if that is not the case. So just to start with today then, a very brief look at why we are really having this session today and why there are so many questions about relocation at the moment. As everybody dialed in today will of course know, Brexit has now taken effect fully in the UK, which means that as of the 1st of January of this year, any new arrivals into the UK from Estonia or indeed anywhere else in the European Union are now subject to UK standard immigration rules. Now, this has caused issues for people, especially in the creative sector, but also with other forms of travel to the UK, because those individuals now find themselves subject to rules and restrictions that were not in place when the UK remained a fully functioning member of the European Union. So the focus really of today's session is to identify some of those restrictions that may be affecting you with your travel or with travel that you are trying to arrange to the UK, and then looking at the solutions and how they fit with our UK immigration system. Now, the effect of Brexit and this introduction of additional restrictions and requirements for travellers to the UK has had a big impact when it comes to UK events and opportunities to participate in them. As you'll be aware, I'm sure, before Brexit, it was absolutely fine for EU artists, EU sports people to travel to the UK without any restriction at all. They didn't need to really discuss their reason for travel on entry. And crucially, there were no restrictions in relation to activities in the UK or payment for those activities in the UK. The big difference now is that those restrictions are really causing issues, particularly with regards to payment. And that's one of the topics that we will be focusing on today, how payment can be arranged under our existing immigration rules. It's worth saying that where events are taking place that are not a commercial enterprise, so no appearance fee, for example, it's often likely that sponsorship isn't required. So while there may now be a slightly different route under which the person enters the UK, that does not mean that they will be subject to the very, very strict sponsorship requirements, applications for visas, all of that kind of intensive application process. Where we do have any kind of payment involved, we need to be very careful about how that connects with the UK rules. So I will be starting off looking at our options by considering all of the different opportunities for temporary travel to the UK as a visitor. Now, it's worthwhile looking at the start of looking at visitor routes, exactly what a visa is and when somebody can use visa-free travel. Visas are documents that are stuck into passports prior to the traveller coming to the UK. If you like, they are a form of pre-approval for entry to the UK. So the application for a visa requires the individual to contact the UK authorities, explain what they would like to do in the UK, when they will do it, and asking whether that will be all right. It's not the case that after Brexit, all EU travellers to the UK need visas. In fact, just like lots of other nations, such as the USA, Australia, for example, EU arrivals in the UK who are visitors are visa-free. They have no requirement to make that pre-approved application before coming to the UK. As a result of that, Estonian nationals who are coming for a short period of time will very rarely need to make an application to the UK in advance of their travel. Visas have their purpose. They are always essential if the person is coming for a long period of time, which is usually more than 6 months. And in some circumstances for people, they can be beneficial for shorter trips. Examples might be where the individual is doing something which is particularly unusual for visitors in the UK, or the individual might have something in their history that means that it would be a better idea to know in advance whether they will be allowed entry. So an example there might be somebody who has criminal convictions, for example, and is not sure whether under visitor rules the UK will permit entry. But in general, I would imagine for most people who are dialed into this call, travel that is going to be for less than 6 months to the UK can be visa-free without any prior application required. Looking at one-off and very short events first of all then. For the reasons just explained, it's often preferable for the individual to have no visa to come to the UK for a one-off or a very short event. This keeps down cost and time in terms of the planning for the travel, but it does come with some restrictions. Visitors are generally restricted to around 6 months in the UK, but in some cases it's a shorter period of time. We'll look at those in a bit more detail in a few moments, but it's worth knowing that visits to the UK can be for as short as a maximum 1 month. Generally speaking, visitors are stamped in for 6 months with each time that they enter the UK. So somebody who entered on the 1st of June might stay here until today, leave, and then return on the 1st of July and receive another stamp for another 6 months. However, it's also the case that visitors are logged each time they come to the UK. And someone who is spending a lot of time here, i.e. more than 6 months in any 12-month period, could be stopped at the border and could be invited to make an application for a long-term visa instead. As a result, visits are great for short and one-off trips, even if there are several during a year, but they're not so good for somebody who wants to come for several months, return home for a short while, and then come back again for several more months. The key thing to know about visitors is that there are some rules which expressly confirm activities that are acceptable in the UK, and then other rules that expressly confirm activities that are never acceptable in the UK. So we'll take a look at some of those in a moment. Travel as a visitor can be fantastic for people. As I say, there is no visa required, so it's very quick and very free and free of charge to arrange. You also have flexibility as a visitor, so it's possible to combine the travel for the purpose of a holiday, for example, with short business travel where those business activities are allowed. Because there are no group UK visas for these short trips, if people are travelling as a large group of people, entering as visitors can be preferable because it allows those people to all travel together without the need for sort of prior applications or anything along those lines. That's relevant when it comes to things like choirs entering the UK, which I know is something of particular interest to several people on this call today. So we'll look at that in a little bit more detail later in the presentation. There are unfortunately some difficulties with visa-free travel as visitors. Restrictions on activity and restrictions on payment are the two most obvious ones. The other thing to bear in mind about travel as a visitor is that because there has been no prior application to the UK, there is potential for refusal at border. This is because someone who's travelling with a visa in advance has already effectively got pre-approval to come to the UK, so it's less likely that a border officer will have lots of questions for them, and less likely that a border officer would say no to that person's entry to the UK. With visitors with no visa, it's the other way around. There has been no conversation before that person arrives at the border, so there may be more questions as that person arrives, and there's higher potential for refusal. Now, in terms of general permissions and restrictions, as I said earlier, generally speaking, it's 6 months for each visit to the UK, but that time period is cut shorter if somebody is taking part in what's called a permitted paid engagement. That's something that will be very relevant to lots of performing artists in particular who want to come to the UK and be paid for their performances here. While the payment can be approved in those circumstances, it does cut short the length of time the person can spend in the UK. So it's a maximum of 1 month where that PPE rule applies. For all visitors, there is the possibility to receive some form of not payment, but remuneration for travel. So things like cost of travel, maintenance and accommodation whilst in the UK can all be legitimately covered for a visitor without breaking any of the rules. What is not necessarily allowed is an actual payment for an activity performed in the UK. So that's a general prohibition in relation to work. There are, however, some specific permissions which relate directly to creative visitors and to sporting visitors. So we'll look at those in a little bit more detail in a few slides' time. Looking at the rules in a bit more detail, this slide sets out the current immigration rules in relation to whether visitors can work in the UK. You can see that in general, there are various things that visitors are not permitted to do, and anything that broadly speaking can be construed as taking employment or working for an organisation is going to be prohibited for a visitor. If you or someone that you're working with is coming to the UK and will be partaking in activity which could, in theory, be considered to be employment or working in the UK, you will need to be confident that that particular activity falls within one of the exceptions to this prohibition on work. There are various exceptions, more unfortunately that relate to creatives than sporting individuals, but they can be quite flexible. Payment is the other area which is of particular concern for visitors in the UK. It's not permitted for visitors to receive any payment from a UK source unless it falls into one of the following listed exceptions. Reasonable expenses we've looked at already. Prize money is one that's highlighted there on the slide, which is quite an interesting one, particularly in relation to sporting and creative travellers. And you can see at F and G on this slide, there are two specific exceptions to the payment provision. Paid performance at permit-free festival is something for creative visitors, which we'll be moving on to. Permitted paid engagements is that category which reduces the time spent in the UK from 6 months to 1 month. So those are two specific examples which can be used by creative and in the case of PPE also sporting visitors to the UK to get around this ban on receiving payment for UK activity. Now, there are lots of activities that visitors are very welcome to do in the UK. Some things are relevant definitely to the types of individuals that you will be working with. Things like attending meetings, giving one-off or short series of talks, attending trade fairs, promotional activity is all generally approved for any type of visitor to the UK. There are then additionally specific approved activities for different categories of visitor. Creatives, for example, are able to give performances. Note there on that slide, this includes as an individual or as part of a group. Competitions or auditions are also approved as an activity in the UK. And I know that prior to today's session, there was an inquiry about castings and auditions for creative visitors. So you can see there, this is an expressly permitted activity for a creative visitor to the UK. Things like personal appearances and promotional activities are all absolutely fine for visitors to do whilst in the UK. And interestingly, as you can see in the last two sections of this slide, this can include personal and technical staff and also film crews. So it's not necessarily just the performer who can be covered by these quite loose and informal visitor rules. There are similar provisions which are applicable to sports players, allowing them to take part in sports tournaments or events, again, individually or as part of a team in this case. And then you can see similar provisions relating to the creative, but this time just in the sector of sport. So appearances, promotional activities, again, are approved. Trials in the place of castings and auditions for sports people. Sports players also have the opportunity for short periods of training, which can be of particular value for individuals who are wanting to come to the UK to explore options, for example. And they're also able to perform on an amateur level. Note again also, we have this option in relation to personal or technical staff for a sports visitor. Now let's look at a couple of those very specific exceptions which allow visitors to be paid on their arrival in the UK. We'll start with permitted paid engagements. So this is the option that is applicable to both artists and creative visitors as well as sporting visitors. You can see at the start of that slide, I've set out the current UK government classification of who is covered by permitted paid engagements. The key things to take away from this slide are that this is a route which is only available to professionals. You can see in both of those first two bullet points, it's a professional artist, entertainer or musician or a professional sports person. So unfortunately, while PPE is a great option for somebody to be paid for their activity in the UK, it will count out those amateur performers. The other key point in relation to permitted paid engagements is that there has to be a direct invitation for the individual to come to the UK. So there's no option for that person to arrive in the UK on a speculative basis in the hope of securing a booking here. Where they are applicable and can be used, permitted paid engagements are extremely useful. They are quite short, limited to that 1 month period, and that's because they relate directly to the specific event that the individual is being invited to participate in. We'll have a look at the sort of documentation that a PPE visitor will arrive at the border with in a moment. But because they are so focused in relation to a specific engagement in the UK, it's unfortunately not possible for a PPE visitor to tie lots and lots of things together. So multiple engagements for multiple different organisations are very tricky to do in a single trip, and it's more likely that an individual will be leaving the UK and returning again for the second engagement as that one starts. Our other exception was the permit-free festivals. Now, this is an option which unfortunately does not include sports people. It's only focused on the creative sector. It does not have the same restriction in relation to the professional status of the visitor. So here you can see in that first bullet point, it is any artist, entertainer or musician who is visiting the UK to perform at one or more of the permit-free festivals. Now, which festivals are permit-free is decided by the UK government in advance. There is a published list, and you will receive a copy of this presentation after today's session, and that link can be viewed to see all of the different festivals that do participate in this list. It's worth noting that if a festival is not currently included on the list, that means that they will not be permit free until at least April 2022. The list is always confirmed for the upcoming year of festivals. Where a festival is permit free, it allows them to invite overseas performers to participate and to pay them for their performance. Because permit free festivals tend to be very, very short events, but they're more informal than a permitted paid engagement, the visitor is able to come to the UK for a longer period of time. So there's no 1 month cap that we see in the PPE category in this PFF possibility. Because it is slightly more informal, it's not necessarily professional artists who are falling under PFF, you are also able to combine different types of travel together. So it's absolutely fine for somebody to come to the UK, play or perform at several different of the permit-free festivals in the UK, and then also perhaps stay for tourism for a short period afterwards. That would be acceptable under the PFF rules. Now, there are some pros and cons in relation to whether a visitor chooses to enter as a PPE or as a PFF visitor. PPE allows for more variation in terms of activities in the UK. It covers creatives and sports people, and it's not just at the specific approved festivals, of which there are only just over 40 in the UK, so it is quite restrictive in the PFF category. However, because PPE is limited to professional performers or professional sports players, it is far more limited in terms of who that particular route can appeal to. Remember as well that an invitation is required for PPE visitors to the UK, so it's a much more formal type of arrangement than any of the other visitor options. PFF is therefore generally more attractive if you have amateur performers, and there is more scope in the creative sector in terms of what particular activities can be performed by those people. But of course, it's only limited to the festivals which are on the pre-approved list. And because that list is approved in advance, if we're not listed at the moment, that does unfortunately count you out probably until next year's performances. The really good thing about both of these options is that they are visa free. So even though this is somebody coming to the UK and being paid to perform in the UK or paid to play in the UK, that is acceptable as a visitor with no need for a prior visa, no need for the expense of applying for visas. However, because it is quite a specific example of visitor entry to the UK, a border officer has to be seen on arrival. These are not options that somebody can use an e-gate on arrival in the UK as an EU national would normally be able to do. It's worthwhile noting because of that, because there will be a face-to-face conversation with a border official, there will obviously be an opportunity for questioning, for looking at documents, and ultimately for making a decision not to allow somebody to enter under one of these two categories. So let's look in a little bit more detail about how and why a border official might decide not to allow somebody to enter the UK as a visitor. Generally speaking, regardless of whether that person is creative, sporting or anything else, there are suitability and criminality assessments made when somebody enters the UK. The border official will have to be satisfied this person is a genuine visitor, somebody who intends to arrive in the UK for a short period and then leave and return back to their home nation. Since Brexit, Some individuals who previously have been able to enter the UK without any kind of restriction might find it more difficult. Criminality is one of those examples. Even a relatively low-level offending in somebody's youth can be relevant to now being admitted as a visitor. So if somebody has something like that in their background and is concerned about whether that will impact their ability to come to the UK, it's always worth a conversation with somebody to work out whether that will be a problem at the border. Some people don't qualify for visitors simply because they just don't meet the requirements and restrictions of that route. As we've seen, there are lots of things that are permitted, but not everything. And obviously, even if you are able to identify a permitted activity and you can fit under one of those exceptions for payment to either be PPE or PFF, it might be that you want to come to the UK for more than 6 months, in which case visitor rules still won't cover you. So where that's the case, where we have planned activities that just don't fit, there will need to be an alternative identified. That's what my colleague Gary will be looking at in the second part of our presentation today. The key point really for visitors is about what documents are needed at the border. As they're travelling visa-free, none of these documents will have been reviewed prior to travel. So it's the case that a visitor has to arrive at the border with the right documents in hand to be able to convince that border official that they are a genuine visitor and they are going to carry out acceptable activities and receive acceptable payment in the UK. First of all, a point about visitors generally. It's best practice to arrive in the UK with proof of your return travel. Even if that's not a booked flight, having a return ticket, for example, even if an open return, is always advisable. In addition, we generally recommend that visitors have details with them about their planned itinerary for the UK, where they might stay, for example, so the border officer knows that there is a plan in place for the duration of the visit. Where you have PPE visitors, so those are the individuals who have been invited by a UK organisation to carry out specific activity, those people need to travel with proof of that formal invitation. So that will be a letter from the UK organisation explaining exactly who the organisation is, who the traveller is, and what that traveller is being engaged to do. It is good practice, if possible, to make reference to the immigration rules in that letter to explain how the activity meets the immigration restrictions. Remember that PPE visitors have this restriction about being professionals, so they must be professional artists or professional sports players. It's very difficult for a border officer to immediately assess whether somebody is generally a professional. So what we would recommend in those circumstances is that PPE visitors also bring a short portfolio to explain their professional standing. What that might look like will vary depending on the individual. But for example, if they are professionally engaged with perhaps an overseas club that they are being released from for a short period of time or something similar, having evidence of prior employment in their particular field is very helpful. Things like critique, reviews, publicity documents are also very useful, particularly in the creative sector, where those individuals tend to be less likely to have been already connected with a particular organisation for a very long period of time. One point to note about documents is that the border official will need them to have been translated into English in order to be able to review them. So it's always worthwhile travelling with the original and most likely Estonian document, but also in English translation. PFF visitors are slightly more informal. They don't have that specific engagement necessarily from an overseas organisation, but they will, of course, have been booked to perform at one of the festivals that is on the approved list. We therefore recommend that PFF visitors do travel with confirmation of their booking. So that might be a letter from the organisation or email correspondence confirming the arranged details of the performance. It's not a requirement for PFF visitors to have that portfolio about their activities, however. They are not falling under that restriction about being recognised professionals in their field. So to finish off this introductory section about short-term options, we're just going to look at a couple of example case studies, starting with the permitted paid engagement route. So in this example, we have Mia and Sebastian, who are accomplished and professional traditional folk dancers. They would like to take part in a 2-week arts festival, which will take place in the UK in October of 2021. The festival is not included on the list of permit-free festivals in the immigration rules. But Mia and Sebastian have been offered payment, so they now need to know whether they can accept that payment and undertake the performance as booked. Now, we know that because they are performing together, that is an acceptable activity for a creative visitor to the UK. If you cast your mind back a few slides to the immigration rule examples where it set out acceptable activities for creatives, performances either individually or as a group were absolutely fine. What we don't know as of yet is whether the payment will be acceptable. We've already been told that that the festival is not permit free, so we know that that is not an option for us to rely on as Mia and Sebastian come to the UK. So if they are going to be paid and that to meet the rules, it would need to be a permitted paid engagement. That is restricted to cases where the individual is a professional, but we already know that Mia and Sebastian are engaged as professional dancers, so that won't be a difficulty for us here. Entering as a permitted paid engagement visitor will limit the duration of the visit to 1 month, but this festival is only 2 weeks, so that would be acceptable. So entering as a permitted paid engagement visitor, as we say, limits that duration of that visit to 1 month. But as we said, the festival here is only 2 weeks, so that will be acceptable and is not a problem in relation to Mia and Sebastian. That's great because it means that they can now travel without a visa. So it means that they don't need to worry about making that application to the Home Office before travel. They don't need to worry about the expense that's engaged with that. But they will need to make sure that they arrive at the border with appropriate evidence, and they will need to see a border officer on arrival, so no e-gate in relation to that entry. What would then happen is that Mia and Sebastian would be stamped into the UK for a 1-month duration in order to complete their engagement. They'd be able to get paid and then they would simply go home. And that is completely fine within the visitor rules. For our second example, we're going to have a look at a permit-free festival. This visitor case study has been drafted on the basis of it being a choir, which is something that I know is relatively of interest to a lot of people that are joining today. So we've used the example of the WOMAD festival in the UK, which is a very well recognised festival which has been included on the list of permit-free festivals for several years. And in this scenario, a choir of Estonian nationals has been invited to the UK to participate in their next event. Now, for the purpose of this case study, we are assuming that those nationals are not people who have criminal convictions or previous UK immigration problems. As I said a little earlier, if any of those sorts of things are bubbling away under the surface, they need to be addressed before somebody attempts to enter the UK. In this scenario, we have the choir travelling to take part in the festival and being paid for their performance. Their travel expenses and accommodation are also being provided for, but crucially, there is an appearance fee which is being paid by the festival organisers. We also have several members of the choir who would like to remain in the UK after the festival for a holiday, although nobody is intending to remain for longer than 6 months. Now, this would be absolutely fine under the permit-free festival rules. Performance as a group is absolutely acceptable as a creative visitor, so that isn't something about which we need to be concerned. However, we know that usually visitors would not be able to be paid for their participation beyond their expenses. So we will need to rely on that permit-free festival exception for the performance fee to be paid here. As already said, WOMAD is included on the list, so that isn't a problem at all. So travel as permit-free festivals here is a really, really good option. It's a great option specifically for this group of people if they are a choir who are not necessarily all professionally engaged as singers and performers, because permit-free festivals do not have that restriction on saying that they must be professionals who are using the route. Another great thing about permit-free festivals for this particular group is that it's slightly more flexible. It's not restricting to just 1 month entry, as Mia and Sebastian had to take part in their festival. So the members of the choir who would like to then holiday in the UK for a few weeks after the festival are very welcome to do so if they're travelling as PFF visitors. As a result of the slightly more informal approach of this route, fewer documents are needed at the border. That's obviously great where you have a big group of people like a choir as well. So it means that there should be less reason for refusal. However, a slight word of caution in relation to that. There have been instances of the Home Office refusing people entry under permit-free festivals. It generally speaking has been where people have needed to apply for a visit visa beforehand, so non-visa nationals, people who always require permission to enter the UK. Obviously, post-Brexit, we don't yet know, unfortunately, how likely it is that the Home Office would refuse an application for somebody who's arriving at the border. But if they're travelling with confirmation of who they are, perhaps of an explanation in terms of the group or the choir or whatever it is that they're travelling with, and of course that confirmation of the invitation from the festival organiser, there really is no reason for the Home Office to refuse entry on that basis. That concludes our section looking at the short-term options in relation to travel to the UK. So I'll be handing over to my colleague Gary now in relation to longer-term visa options.
Thanks a lot, Shara, and hello, everybody. My name's Gary. I'm a solicitor at Latitude Law in Manchester. I'm going to just talk through the longer-term visa options. So you've obviously heard there's a lot you can achieve without any kind of prior formality just by entering as a visitor, but some things you can't achieve. And I think it's also worth saying that sometimes you won't want to leave things to chance at the airport. You know, there may be something that's a little bit more difficult to explain. So you might want to think about getting some prior entry clearance or some prior approval before traveling to the UK. Okay, so the basis of the UK's longer term entry requirements is the concept of sponsor licensing. So organizations are required to apply for a sponsor license from the Home Office, the UK's Interior Ministry. And once it has that license, it can sponsor workers or people it wishes to support in their entry into the UK. We're going to be focusing in this session on the licensing options in the creative and sporting sectors. The creative organizations that we tend to work with are really only looking at short-term sponsorship. They're not looking to, for example, employ people on long-term contracts to actually remain and live in the UK and eventually settle in the UK. So the specific provisions for the creative arts and the sporting sectors can be advantageous over these kind of longer term kind of skilled worker sponsorship options that are available. Okay, one example of that in the creative sector would be where a promoter is engaging a performer from overseas. That promoter, there might not be a direct contractual relationship with the individual performer, and there might be a series of engagements, and in some instances that promoter can sponsor those series of engagements. So a tour, for example, would be the most common example. For organizations, it's worth bearing in mind that applying for a license can be quite a time-consuming process. There's a lot of compliance involved. You've got to have all your recruitment, all your HR procedures in place before you apply to the Home Office for a license, and it can take under standard processing take between 8 and 12 weeks to get a license. So certainly build that in to you're planning if you're an organisation looking to get licensed by the Home Office. So once an organisation has a license, it's in a position to issue what are called certificates of sponsorship, what we would call COSs, which is just an electronic document. Essentially, it's a reference number, and the organisation kind of allocates that to the individual it wishes to sponsor. And each time you do that, it's going to cost you £199 per certificate for long-term sponsorship. But importantly, in the creative sector, if you've got a lot of certificates to issue to a large group, for example, it's just £21 per certificate. Also importantly, the immigration skills charge, which is another government fee, essentially, is not payable for these kind of temporary sponsorship arrangements, these shorter term arrangements. Okay, so we're going to look at the T5 creative. T5 used to be known as Tier 5. I don't know particularly why the UK decided to make it a little bit more racy by calling it T5, but this is the creative temporary worker option. And it's kind of a theme in creative and sporting that only people who are at quite high level in their profession can be sponsored. Okay, so we'll look at it in the sports context in a little while, but for performers, the idea that somebody's making a unique or special contribution to UK's cultural life or enriching the UK's cultural environment, these are kind of key requirements for short-term creative sponsorship. There's a series of codes of practice which are included in the UK's immigration rules, which put kind of meat on the bones of the sponsorship process for the creative sector. There are certain types of creative activity, for example, actors, opera, ballet. They have very specific rules on who can be sponsored and what the requirements are for sponsorship in those fields. Okay, a couple of kind of general points about T5, about the short-term sponsorship. It's not a category that's going to lead to the individual being able to settle or live permanently in the UK, but they can have their family with them. And this maintenance requirement, that's just, this is a fairly common requirement in UK sponsored work immigration, this idea that the individual who's being sponsored has to show they've got some funds. They've got to have held that amount, £1,270, for at least 28 days in a personal bank account. Okay, so practicalities of T5 creative sponsorship. You can't apply for the certificate of sponsorship more than 3 months before the engagement or engagements are due to begin. Resident labour market testing is still a thing for T5 creative in a lot of sponsored work routes in the UK since Brexit. We've done away with this kind of formal resident labour market testing. In practice, it's not such a common thing because quite often under the codes of practice that I mentioned earlier, there are lots of exceptions to the need to test the labour market. A couple of examples of that, where you've got an individual who's got particular skills, for example, or particular way of performing, which is not going to be readily available. For example, traditional dance or traditional theatre forms might fall into that category. So those kind of people, they're not going to, the sponsor's not going to have to show that they've tried to recruit somebody from inside the UK to perform that particular role. Continuity is another point as well. If you can show in a TV production, for example, that the actor is needed for continuity purposes, then no labour market testing is required. Another example of the kind of flexibility in short-term T5 sponsorship is that It can be sponsored for consecutive engagements, but there can't be more than 14 days between each engagement. So again, the example of a tour by a band or a musical artist is relevant there. And maximum 12 months can be extended up to 2 years, but as we said, quite often what we see are people who are coming on much shorter term engagements in the UK. Okay, moving to sporting sponsorship. This is short-term sporting sponsorship. There's a 12-month limit here, not a 24-month limit. And a couple of points to make about sports sponsorship. The main one really, the kind of overarching theme really, is that the sports governing body has an input into sporting sponsorship. So the sponsoring organisation, say it's a sports club, a soccer club, must get the support of its endorsing body. So in the UK, that's the Football Association. The Football Association would have to support that football club's application for a sponsor license. Once the club is licensed, it can take over, it can bring over short-term sports players for up to 12 months. And each time it does that, each time it issues this certificate of sponsorship, it has to get, again, support from the FA, the endorsing body in the UK. And a couple of general points there. Then you see that maintenance figure again, dependents can accompany, and importantly, this is not a route that leads to settlement in the UK. Okay. All right. This is a slide. It's something that's of interest really to Estonian citizens, certainly, because Estonian citizens are not visa nationals. They are able to access this visa exemption. So even though they might require sponsorship to enter the UK for a series of creative professional engagements or sporting engagement, for example, there is this option to travel without getting a visa in Tallinn. So the rules fairly strict, really. Must be an engagement of 3 months or less. And obviously, you've got to meet all the other requirements for entry as a short-term sponsored worker. The sponsoring organisation, the club or the promoter or the theatre in the UK will have issued a certificate of sponsorship, and the individual travelling to the UK will turn up at the airport with that electronic confirmation. So as I said before, it's just a reference number essentially. You would need to see a border force officer. Can't just travel through it. You can't just enter through the e-gate. You would then show the electronic confirmation, the certificate of sponsorship, and you'd be permitted to enter the UK on that basis for up to 3 months. Okay, so that's short-term sponsorship dealt with. Long-term sponsorship is now divided for our purposes really today into 2. So skilled worker, the kind of the standard skilled worker route is where creative long-term sponsorship now sits. So long-term assignments, I suppose typically here you might see, for example, a conductor of an orchestra or an artistic director for a ballet company who's been recruited and is coming over here to the UK to work in a longer term role. So you can be sponsored for up to 6 years. That's slightly misleading because after 5 years, so long as the individual's lived continuously in the UK, that individual can apply for permanent residence, can apply to settle in the UK. Okay, again, there's a note here with the sporting route, the endorsing body, so the FA in my example, does retain an interest. The FA would still need to support that footballer coming over on a contract to a UK club. And in the creative sector, there are a series of what are called standard occupation codes of practice and certain minimum skill and salary levels do apply. So the skilled worker, sorry, this it's a very racy slide, a bit hard to read though. These are kind of the key components really of the standard skilled worker route. So the SOC, or the Standard Occupation Code, as I mentioned before, there's a long list of them published in the UK's immigration rules. So you're essentially matching the role to one of those occupation codes. Financial requirements, often the sponsoring organisation will what's called certify the financial requirement on behalf of a sponsored skilled worker. There's an English language requirement as well, intermediate, so it's level B1 on the CEFR, which is the Common European Framework for English language. So intermediate English language ability is required. The long-term sports person option is called T2, used to be called Tier 2, now T2 sporting. Okay, and again, it's the idea of it's only really reserved for elite sportsmen and women and coaches. Endorsement, again, as I mentioned before, and the sponsoring club has to demonstrate in sponsoring somebody long term that their entry to the UK will develop sport at the highest level. Now, the UK's endorsing bodies will often have their own set of criteria for sponsoring individuals. So again, we go back to our footballer example. The Football Association here in the UK has quite a detailed structure for assessing whether somebody is capable of being sponsored, capable of developing the sport at the highest level. And they look to, for example, an Estonian player. Have they appeared for the Estonian national team? What percentage of fixtures have they performed in over a set period in the last couple of years, for example? It's all very clearly set out in the football arena. It's less prescriptive in other sports, you know, so there may be some sports governing bodies that don't in fact have that kind of framework at all. They don't have any additional rules, so they'll be looking at cases on an individual basis, really. And again, there's various financial, the English language requirement, slightly lower for T2 sporting than it is for the skilled worker route that I mentioned earlier. It's level A1 for T2 sporting. I think the rest of those points are fairly self-explanatory. So it is a route that leads to settlement. The English language level B1, that's for settlement. That's the kind of intermediate level. That's what you need in order to settle. And you've also got to do this life in the UK test, which is a test of your knowledge of Queen and country, essentially. Okay, moving to the end now. That's all the sponsored options dealt with. We've got a couple of non-sponsored options. The first is global talent. This is, as the name suggests, quite an exclusive immigration route for the brightest and best. Importantly, it's not available in the sports category, so relevant today for today's audience, really, in the arts and culture sector. And the UK's Arts Council, and in Wales and Scotland and Northern Ireland, there are separate bodies, will provide endorsement for very highly talented or highly regarded individuals who are potential candidates for this particular visa route. And this is a good route if you are particularly well known in your field, well known internationally as well. If you're going to be exceptional talent, if you're exceptional promise, that's the kind of individual who might be earlier in their career. And we've done work for example, a number of opera singers, haven't we, Shara? And you know, some of those have been relatively early in their career, you know, trained at local conservatoires, and they've managed to get onto the exceptional promise route, which is a 5-year route to settling in the UK. If you're exceptional talent, if you're already on top of your game, then that's a 3-year route to settlement. So quite a nice option. And the final non-sponsored option, we've not dealt today with EU citizens who previously lived in the UK who might have gained what's called pre-settled or settled status in the UK. That's really a subject for another day, I suppose. But this frontier worker option is for people who've previously worked in the UK and who may qualify for it's either a 2 or a 5-year work permit to come to the UK, but there has to have been residence prior to the Brexit date. Okay, so to close, a couple of case studies. If I've got time, somebody please shout if I've not got time. I'm really sorry, we've overrun a little bit. This is a short-term situation. You can see the theatre company, Board of Theatre Companies based in the UK, and they want to bring individual performers. They're not linked to, it's not linked to a permit-free festival. The engagements will be a single venue, and there'll be theatre runs for 6 to 8 weeks, and they're going to be paid in the UK. So looking at sponsorship options here, you would always check if any EU performers have a prior entitlement to, you know, pre-settled or settled status, so they can work without any further restriction. If not, then Border Theatre Productions would require a T5 creative sponsor license to bring those individuals over if it wants to pay them. So these are longer term, so remember, they go beyond the permitted paid engagement limit of 1 month. So under T5 creative, they can be sponsored for up to 3 months without having to get a visa. They can be sponsored for longer if they do get a visa prior to travel. Once again, thanks very much for having us, Rhett and Kirsty, for organising this, and I'll hand you back. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much to Gary and Sarah for this thorough presentation, and to all the listeners here. It might seem quite a sophisticated and difficult system, but once you work all this material through, there's a certain logic to it, and we can manage it. So right now, I would like to ask if anyone here has any questions about this presentation, or specific questions about specific situations. If yes, please raise your hand. And while we are waiting for the questions, perhaps we can also give the word to Arts Info Point. Perhaps Gary can introduce them as well. So.
Yeah, thanks very much, Rhett. I'm going to introduce Ellie Flack, who works for Welsh Arts International, and who's involved in the UK's Arts Info Point project. So, Ellie, over to you. Do you want to explain a little bit about the project?
Yeah, thanks, Gary. Thanks, Rhett and Kirsty, for inviting us today. Just to let everyone know about the Arts Info Point UK project, I'm here with my colleague Katie James, who's there. We work for Wales Arts International, which is part of the Arts Council of Wales, and we're working with our colleagues in Arts Council England, Creative Scotland and Arts Council Northern Ireland on a joint project called Arts Info Point UK, which is looking at providing this kind of practical information to artists and creative professionals who are coming into the UK. Now, it is related to what Gary and Shara have said today. They've done some presentations with us as well, but we're looking at developing a portal of information where you can be signposted to different places. It'll be information on visas, tax, social security, also movement of goods as well. So this is all in development. I think Katie's put our website up there, so keep an eye on it. Katie, if you'll put our info point email address as well, because we'll have a mailing list to sign up to and social media. This is all happening in the coming weeks, so just keep an eye out for that. But just to say that we've got a few events up there already, but they are primarily for UK-based artists going to various EU countries at the moment, but we will have more in the future which are coming into the UK, and it's a lot to take in. I know Gary and Shara do a brilliant job of explaining quite a difficult process, but it's always good to be able to refer back to some online material when you actually need to look at it. I know the COVID restrictions make it maybe a little bit difficult, another hurdle at the moment, but in the future we hope that there'll be a lot more travel as well. Thank you.
So thank you, Seli, and also welcome, Katie, for joining us this session today, and thank you for sharing information about your organization. And we surely, Kersti and I, will keep an eye on the information on the homepage, and I welcome also everyone else to do this. We have the first question. So this is already about the customs and declaration. Can you perhaps comment this, or perhaps we can come to this question back later when we have we also have one expert from the Estonian Customs and Customs Board here. So.
Yeah, thanks for the question. It's not really our area, I'm afraid. I know that the rules on declaring instruments and the cabotage rules are now quite potentially complicated, aren't they? Seli, I know that that's something that Arts Info Point has included, isn't it, in the resource? Do you know? Do you have any insight into that? Because I'm afraid we're just about the people. I'm afraid.
It's something we will be looking at, and hopefully we'll be doing a session on this later in the summer, specifically about bringing goods over. But I'm just going to have a look to signpost you now for the relevant pages on the UK government website that will tell you about that. But if you just bear with me, we'll put it in the chat for you.
Thank you. So, and another question.
Yeah, sorry, I've just seen the question. Yeah, so media representative. I think that is most likely going to be covered by the visit rules. There are lots of permitted activities under the UK's visit rules. You'll appreciate they can't kind of spell out every single possible situation which is going to be allowed under the standard visit entry rules, but from memory, and Shara probably will know better than me, I think
I do.
I think media representative is actually included in there, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah. So under the general permitted activities for visitors, there are some overseas rules which have got very specific things that are approved in the UK, and journalists, correspondents, producers or cameramen gathering information for overseas publications, programmes or films are all permitted. So that and specifically also the topic of the question, that would all be covered under visitor rules. So the key thing really in terms of why that's okay in relation to visitor rules is because this is covering an event which is actually going to be within the Estonian press. If it was covering it within the UK press, so somebody travelling to the UK covering an event and then perhaps selling that review to UK publications, that could start to cross the line into what's not acceptable activity, particularly if there's a source of UK income. But if it's an Estonian journalist who's coming and is carrying out work for their Estonian employer, that's absolutely fine.
So.
That's an interesting question about accommodation. There aren't specific requirements particularly. We said earlier when looking at visitor rules in terms of what documents to travel with, it's always useful to have evidence of your itinerary in terms of where you might stay and what you might do in the UK. And so having confirmation that there is accommodation available to the individual for the duration of their trip is very helpful. That doesn't have to be a particular type of accommodation. So it's equally as acceptable to be staying in a paid hotel as it is to be staying at a property that's owned by a friend or even by the actual traveller in the UK, as long as the border official is satisfied that that traveller is a genuine visitor. So are they coming for a fixed period of time? Are they coming for an acceptable activity in the UK? Do they intend to genuinely leave?
I think that's quite a common arrangement, isn't it? Homestays for visiting artists, certainly for some of the festivals we've worked around, you know, people will come and stay in local communities with other artists, for example, and that's all perfectly fine. Yeah.
So at the moment, there seems no other questions interesting for the people, but I guess that all the participants here today, they just need to take a look at all this information and materials, and the actual questions will start rise when the actual traveling returns. And as I said before, the information will be put to our homepage, and we also have prepared some. So we will have this kind of schemes and table where you can follow the links, which type of visa and where to click the link and what type of documentation is needed. And today's presentation will also be put on our webpage. So since we are running out of time for the first session and there seems to be no more questions, I think we can wrap this session up. And again, many thanks to Gary and Sarah for being here today and presenting this important topic, and also to Sadie and Katie, and we will keep in touch with Arts Info Point, and especially regarding all this musical and also exhibition materials, how to transport them to the UK. So in the field of museum and art, this is also an important topic. So I think we can wrap this session up and we will move to the next part. So thank you very much for our guests from the UK.
Thank you.
Nii, ja tuleme siis nüüd, lülitume uuesti eesti keelele üle ja tuleme siis nüüd selle suuna peale, kuidas edaspidi siis kutsuda oma UK koostööpartnereid Eestisse, kuidas see koostöö siin peaks toimuma. Meil on täna siin külas seda teemat tutvustamas Siseministeeriumist ekspert Kattai ja ka migratsiooninõustaja Alina Suvorova, ja meil tegelikult on siin kuuldel ka üks ekspert Maksu- ja Tolliametist, mis puudutab siis just selliste Eestis tööjõu ja töötasude maksustamist. Aga ma annaksin siis sõna nüüd Harrile ja Alinale. Ja jälle, et siis presentatsiooni ajal saab panna siia chati küsimusi ja siis pärast on võimalik ka küsida, kui see presentatsioon on läbi. Aga annan siis sõna.
Tere päevast kõigile. Võib-olla mõned üldised kommentaarid enne, kui me läheme konkreetselt kultuuritöötajate juurde. Siis ütleme kultuuritöötajate juurde, et need on sellised üldised tähelepanekud, mis tulenevad meie igapäevasest elust, praktikast ja inimeste küsimustest. Et nüüd me läheme järjest, kuidas öelda, edasi sügavamale sellest Ühendkuningriigi väljaastumisest EL-ist, Euroopa Liidust ja võib-olla on oluline silmas pidada konkreetselt võib-olla mõnda olulist punkti. Esiteks, et kõik need, võib-olla puudutab neid, kes tulevad nüüd Euroopa Liitu ja need inimesed, kellel ei ole siis kuskil Euroopa Liidu liikmesriigis elamisõigust. Et Briti kodanikel on oluline omada siis Euroopa Liidu liikmesriikides viibimiseks seaduslikku alust. Ehk on see siis viisavaba liikumine, ühe liikmesriigi viisa, elamisluba ja nii edasi. Viisavaba liikumine on lubatud 90 päeva 180 päeva jooksul, kuid oluline on arvestada seda, et see on selline jooksev periood, inimesed liiguvad ja need inimesed, kes väga tihti liiguvad, siis see periood võib täis saada. Ja oluline just siin, et inimesed ise jälgiks, vaataks ja ei ületaks seda perioodi, sellepärast et vastasel juhul võivad järgneda sanktsioonid, kui seda on ületatud. Nüüd, need inimesed, kes juba elavad kuskil Euroopa Liidu liikmesriigis, siis nendele kehtivad edasi senised õigused, põhimõtteliselt samasugused, nagu olid Euroopa Liidu kodanikuna Euroopa Liidus elades. Aga need õigused on seotud siis konkreetse liikmesriigiga, kus ta elas väljaastumishetkel. Kui nüüd näiteks Eestis elav Briti kodanik läheb tööle Saksamaale, siis Saksamaal või Soomes või mis iganes teises liikmesriigis ta peab taotlema seal kohapeal on siis elamisluba, õigus töötada ja nii edasi, vastava konkreetse liikmesriigi reeglite järgi. Et kuna igas riigis võivad olla teatud erisused, siis soovitame igal juhul enne uurida, kuidas on see elamine ja töötamine seal lubatud ja selle järgi siis käituda. Et siin sellist ühtset universaalset nõu anda ei saa. Ja mida peab veel arvestama seda, et kui nüüd see väljaastumislepingu kohaldamisalasse kuuluv Briti kodanik läheb ära Eestist näiteks, siis tema senine kaitse, mida väljaastumisleping tagas, lõpeb sisuliselt. Seal on küll teatud erisusi, lubatud ajutine äraolek ja nii edasi. Näiteks alalistel elamisõigusega inimestel on lubatud ära olla kuni 5 aastat ja siis ta saab tagasi pöörduda samasuguste õigustega jätkata Eestis elamist. Ja siin tasub enne uurida, kui selliseid liikumisi on vaja teha. Ja tahaksin ka võib-olla Briti kodanikele, kes Eestis elavad, meelde tuletada seda võib-olla, et kuna elamisõigus Eestis on seotud kehtivate elukoha andmetega ehk elukoha registreerimisega rahvastikuregistris, siis kui Briti kodanikud vahetavad oma elukohta, nad kindlasti jälgiks, et nad uuendavad ka oma andmeid rahvastikuregistrist, teevad vastava elukoha teate. Need on lihtsad protsessid, aga kui elamisõigus lõpeb koos elukoha andmete puudumisega, siis on seda palju raskem tagasi saada. Et seetõttu palun hoidke oma elukoha andmeid kehtivana. Siis 1. juuli käesoleva aasta on võib-olla selline järgmine oluline etapp, mida tuleks meeles pidada. Eriti nendel, kellel on elamisõigus kuskil Euroopa Liidu liikmesriigis. Nimelt, kui siiani oli võimalik kasutada olemasolevaid dokumente liikumisel teise liikmesriiki või välispiiride ületamisel, siis edaspidi peaks olema kõigil, kellel on elamisõigus liikmesriigis kuskil liikumisel juba uut nagu staatust tõendav dokument, mis on see uus elamisloa kaart. Kui seda ei ole, siis võivad järgneda sanktsioonid, on raske tõendada oma elamisõigust mingis Euroopa Liidu liikmesriigis ja kõige halvemal juhul on jälle sanktsioonid, kui kuskil kohapealsed politsei- ja piirivalvevõimud ei suuda tuvastada. Aga igal juhul, kui teil on kaasas kasvõi, kui Briti kodanikel on kaasas kasvõi kehtetu dokument, nad hoiaks seda ligi. Et vastasel juhul küsitakse templit, kui seda piiriületustemplit ei ole, kehtivat elamisõigust ei ole, oleks nagu tegemist illegaaliga. Et seetõttu on oluline meeles pidada, et alates juulist juba liikumisel kindlasti kaasas kantas kõiki dokumente, mis on siis kehtiv reisidokument ja elamisõiguste enda dokument. Kui ei ole nüüd seda dokumenti inimesel ja tal on elamisõigus Eestis, siis kui ta tuleb otse Eestisse, on piiril võimalik kontrollida elamisõigust ja ta saaks tulla koju, taotleda uut dokumenti. Samuti saab taotleda saatkonnas uut elamisloa kaarti, kuigi reeglina on seal ette nähtud nendele, kellel on elukoht registreeritud välismaal, kuid meie teada on praegu Eesti saatkond Ühendkuningriigis siiani võtnud neid taotlusi vastu. Aga see ei ole võib-olla väga pikalt ei pruugi kesta. Et igal juhul hoidke oma elukoha andmed kehtivad, igal juhul vahetage dokument välja võimalikult kiiresti, kui te reisite. Ja need, ütleme, kui dokument on kehtetu, näiteks Eestis elaval Briti kodanikul on tulenevalt Covidist, mis iganes on muutunud kehtiv ID-kaart juba kehtetuks selle kehtivuse lõppemisega, siis tema elamisõigus Eestis tegelikult ei kao. Elamisõigus on seotud elukoha andmetega rahvastikuregistris ehk kehtiv elukoha kanne ja seetõttu see inimene ei pea muretsema, et tema nüüd õigused on kadunud. Nüüd veel, mis puutub Eestis elavaid Briti kodanikke, siis Eesti-siseselt kehtib see ID-kaart edasi. Sellega saab teha kõiki sarnased toimingud nagu senini, tõendada oma isikut, minna elektroonilisse keskkonda ja nii edasi. Kuigi nad kehtivad Eesti-siseselt edasi, siis eelmine punkt me märkisime just, et igal juhul, kui liigutakse, on vajalik omada uut elamisõigust tõendavat dokumenti. Ja see on üpris lihtne protsess, avaldus Politsei- ja Piirivalveameti teenindustes, seal koha pealt saab võtta sõrmejäljed, teha pildi ja tasuda riigilõivu ja maksimum 30 päeva pärast saab minna järgi sellele dokumendile. Siis, mis muutub võib-olla tööandjate jaoks keerukaks, on see, et edaspidiselt meil on kahesuguse staatusega Briti kodanikud Eestis. On need, kes on elanud siin varasemalt Euroopa Liidu kodaniku seaduse alusel ja jätkavad siin elamist. Ja siis pärast 1. aprilli sisenenud kõik uued Briti kodanikud, kes siis kuuluksid välismaalaste seaduse reguleerimisalasse. Et tööandjatel võib-olla on natuke raske neid eristada, kuna õigusliku staatuse erinevusega on ka ütleme, nõuded näiteks tööle võtmisel, töötamisel Eestis erinevad. Et kõik, kes on siin elanud varasemalt, kellel on see väljaastumislepingu kohane kaitse, nemad jätkavad täpselt samade tingimustega nagu senini ja neil ei kohaldu tööle võtmisel ei palgakriteeriumid, ei töötukassa loa nõue ja nii edasi. Ja samuti nende pereliikmetele. Kõik need Briti kodanikud, kes siis sisenevad Eestisse esmakordselt või kes on juba nüüd sisenenud pärast 1. aprilli ja asunud tööle, siis neile kehtivad kõik need välismaalastele tavapäraselt kehtivad reeglid, mis on välismaalaste seaduses. Et Alina kohe hakkab sellest rääkima ja räägib täpsemalt.
Tere ka minu poolt, Harri, kas sa annad nüüd sõna mulle, jah? Saan ma õigesti aru, või sa võid veel jätkata?
Tahtsin veel siin ühe lause juurde tuua seda, et kui me rääkisime või rõhutada veel seda, et kui Eestis elav see Briti kodanik saab töötada rahulikult seniste reeglite järgi, nagu siiani on kehtinud, siis näiteks nüüd jälle Briti kodanik, kes tuleb Soomest, tal on see väljaastumislepingu kohane kaitse Soomes, siis jällegi Eestisse asudes ta läheb välismaalaste seaduse reguleerimisalasse ja ta on siin sarnaselt nagu täiesti uus esmakordselt Eestis sisenenud Briti kodanik. Loomulikult seal on ka jälle teatud erisusi, näiteks pikaajalise elamisõigusega või elamisloaga inimesed ja nii edasi. Et siin me soovitame jälle võtta ühendust migratsiooninõustajatega, küsida, uurida natuke. Et seal on soodustusi, seal on erisusi, on olemas veel Euroopa Liidu ülesed skeemid, mis võimaldavad lihtsamalt liikuda. Aga võib-olla sellise üldise punkti juures sellesse väga täpselt ei lähe. Ja nagu ma mainisin, siis võib-olla kõige olulisem on eelnevalt küsida, uurida, helistada meile. Me oleme soovitanud alati pöörduda migratsiooninõustajate poole. Telefon on siin olemas 6123 500 või saata meil neile, võib ka meile saata ja nemad on need inimesed, kes oskavad teile otse rääkida, põhjalikult rääkida vastavalt teie juhtumile ja üks järgmine rääkija on meie Alina, kes nõustab igapäevaselt väga tihedalt kõiki inimesi ja ettevõtteid. Et nüüd ma annaks edasi sõna Alinale. Aitäh!
Aitäh, Harri! Nii, minu nimi on Alina Suvorova ja nagu Harri ütles, töötan siin migratsiooninõustajate tiimis. Nüüd ma proovin siis teile jagada minu slaide. Nii, täna siis ma räägin väga lühidalt siis UK kodaniku töötamise Eestis just nendest, kes tulevad siia Eestisse juba alates 1. aprillist 2021. Et nende töötamist ja elamist nüüd siis reguleerib välismaalaste seadus, et lühidalt see on VMS, et esiteks ma natuke tutvustan, mis tähendab Eestis töötamine välismaalaste seaduse mõistes. See on paragrahv 8. Eestis töötamine välismaalaste seaduse tähenduses on mis tahes tegevus Eestis töölepingu või muu lepingu alusel, samuti muu tegevus teise isiku heaks, mille puhul võib eeldada tulu või muu varalise hüve saamist ja sõltumatu tegevuse aluseks oleva lepingu liigist, vormist või lepingu sõlminud teise poole asukohast või elukohast, kui välisleping või antud seadus ei sätesta teisiti. Ja alates 1. aprillist ja hiljem saabuvad kodanikud vajavad Eestis viibimiseks, elamiseks ja töötamiseks siis VMS-is sätestatud aluseid. Kui on soov töötada Eestis lühiajaliselt, siis selleks pöördub tööandja Politsei- ja Piirivalveameti poole ja registreerib lühiajalise töötamise Eestis. Üldjuhul seda saab teha kuni 365 päeva 455 päevase perioodi jooksul. Ehk siis aasta aega tohib isik töötada ja peale seda on vaja teha 3-kuulist pausi ja töötada ta ei või. Lühiajaline Eestis töötamine, mida teeb tööandja Politsei- ja Piirivalveametis, on vaid luba töötamiseks, aga selleks, et töötada Eestist lühiajaliselt, peab isikul olema ka kehtiv viibimisalus, mis katab kogu seda perioodi. Sellest ma räägin veel eraldi ka edasi. Kui on soov, et UK kodanik Eestis töötaks pikemalt, siis selleks saab isik ehk välismaalane ise taotleda elamisluba, kui ta täidab elamisloa omamiseks vajalikud tingimused. Kui see on elamisluba seoses töötamisega, siis tööandja peab olema tema kutsuja pool. Oluline nüanss on see, et kõik UK kodanikud on vabastatud sisserände piirarvust ehk kvoodist. Seda sätestab VMS paragrahv 105.9.1. Elamisloa kaardi ja elamisloa riigilõivud on tavapärased ja nendega saab tutvuda siis Politsei- ja Piirivalveameti kodulehel. Kui taotlus esitatud Eestis, siis riigilõiv on natuke väiksem, kui seda esitades Eesti välisesinduses. Ka UK kodaniku pereliikmed, kes on nüüd ka kolmanda riigi kodanikud, kui nad on ise UK kodanikud, taotlevad elamisluba VMS-i alusel ja tingimustel. Natuke räägin siis lühiajalise töötamise registreerimisest. Et kui tööandja soovib võtta tööle UK kodaniku, siis üldjuhul peab olema registreeritud ka lühiajaline töötamine Politsei- ja Piirivalveametis. Tavakorras seda registreeritakse 15 tööpäeva jooksul. Menetlus võib ka pikeneda, kui taotlus esitatud puudustega või menetluse raames soovib menetleja küsida mingeid andmeid või dokumente tööandja käest juurde. Lühiajalist töötamist tegema ei pea, kui isiku töötamise õigus tuleb vahetult seadusest. See on VMS paragrahv 105. Siinpool ma tahaks välja tuua, et kui tegemist on ajutise iseloomuga töötamisega, mille kestus ei ületa 5 päeva 30-päevase perioodi jooksul, siis selleks LTR ehk lühiajaline töötamine registreerima ei pea. Aga kindlasti selleks, et isik saaks siin tööd teha, need 5 päeva, peab tal olema kehtiv viibimisalus. Viibimisalustest ma räägin natuke edasi ka. Seda juba mainisin, et lühiajaliselt on võimalik Eestis töötada, ehk siis tööandja üldjuhul saab seda registreerida kuni 365 päeva 455 järjestikuse päeva jooksul. Üldjuhul kehtib ka palgakriteeriumi, palganõue, mis on vähemalt võrdne Eesti aasta keskmise brutopalgale. Ja alates 3. märtsis on see natuke tõusnud ja nüüd on summas 1448 eurot kuus brutos. Kui te soovite kutsuda tööle lühiajalise töötamise registreeringuga loomingulist töötajat ja tööandja, ehk siis teie tegutsete etendusasutuse seaduse mõistes, siis palgamäär ehk palgakriteerium ei rakendu. Mis on lühiajalise töötamise registreeringu tingimused? Esimene see, et välismaalasel on töökoha täitmiseks nõutud kvalifikatsioon, haridus, terviseseisund, töökogemus ning vajalikud erialaoskused ja teadmised. Seda hindab tööandja. Tööandja peab olema Eestis registreeritud. Üldjuhul, nagu ma ütlesin, et tekib kohustus maksta kriteeriumile vastavat töötasu. Kui lühiajaline töötamine registreeritud, siis on tööandjal ka kohustused. Üks nendes on siis teavitamiskohustus, teavitada Politsei- ja Piirivalveametit sellest, et isik asus tööle, ei asunud tööle, töötamise tingimuse muutmise osas, lepingu ennetähtaegsel lõpetamise osas või välismaalase töötamise lõpetamise osas. Seda kohustust ei ole vaid nende andmete osas, ehk seda me loeme täidetuks, Politsei- ja Piirivalveamet loeb täidetuks, kui need andmed on nähtavad töötamise registris. Samas me alati palume tööandjat meid sellest ka eraldi teavitada, kuna meil kahjuks puudub interaktiivne suhtlus töötajate registriga, et siis kui te eraldi veel informeerite meid sellest, et isikuga on tööleping lõpetatud, et ta on töötamise registrist maha kantud, et siis Politsei- ja Piirivalveamet saab omalt poolt ka tegutseda operatiivsemalt. Mida tuleb tööandjal kontrollida välismaalase tööle võtmisel? Kontrollima tema Eestis viibimise ja töötamise õiguslikku alust. On keelatud sõlmida lepingut töötamiseks ja koheselt on kohustatud lõpetama vastavat lepingut, kui välismaalasel puudub õigus Eestis viibimiseks või töötamiseks. Säilitama koopiad andmetest ja dokumentidest, mis tõendavad välismaalase Eestis töötamise õiguslikku alust. Neid tuleb säilitada 10 aasta jooksul. Natuke räägin siis viibimisalustest, et üldjuhul kehtib UK kodanikel kehtib viisavabadus Schengeniga, sellest Harri juba rääkis ka, et see on kuni 90 päeva, 180 päeva perioodi jooksul. Need 90 päeva antakse mitte iga riigi peale, see antakse kogu Schengeni peale, sealhulgas ka Eesti peale. Isik saab ise kontrollida, jälgida, kas tal on need 90 päeva ära kasutatud või mitte, kasutades viisakalkulaatorit, mida saab guugeldades leida ka. T-viisa ehk pikaajaline viisa. Nagu ma mainisin, et kui on soov Eestis pikemalt töötada kuni siis 365 päeva, on see üldjuhul, siis sellest UK kodanikul viisavabadust ei jätku. On siis võimalus ja õigus taotleda pikaajalist ehk D-liiki viisat, mida saab maksimaalselt taotleda kuni 365 päeva. Kui taotlus esitatakse saatkonnas, siis dokumentidega ja riigilõivu rekvisiitidega saab tutvuda, kui te vaatate selle lingi peale, seal on kõik informatsioon olemas. Kui isik esitab taotluse PPA teeninduses, neid on kokku 6 teenindust, kes võtavad D-viisa taotlusi vastu, siis nende dokumentidega saab tutvuda meie kodulehel. Kindlasti on vaja jälgida seda, et kui isik pöördub PPA teeninduse poole ja taotleb siin kohapeal PPA teeninduses D-viisat, et tal oleks vähemalt 10 tööpäeva seaduslikku viibimist Eestis. Alates 17. maist saab pikaajalist D-liiki viisat taotleda teeninduses vaid siis, kui välismaalane on eelnevalt täitnud oma pikaajalise viisa ankeeti eeltaotluste keskkonnas. Eeltaotluste keskkond on 3-keelne, eesti, inglise ja vene. Kui taotlus on täidetud, siis saab välismaalane enda emaili aadressile unikaalse numbri, millega ta saab siis koha peale teenindusse minna ka. Me väga soovitame, et koos selle numbriga saab välismaalane ka ankeedi, et seda ankeedi eelnevalt ka välja trükkida, et koha peal teeninduses esitama. Elamisloa alusel Eestis töötamine, et üldjuhul, kui välismaalasel on Eestis elamisluba, see annab õiguse ka töötada. Kui see on piiratud või isik kes on saanud vastava loa, ei tohi töötada, siis see on sätestatud eraldi vastava tähtajalise elamisloa andmise aluse juures. Kui isik on saanud tähtajalise elamisloa töötamiseks Eestis, siis see on seotud konkreetse tööandjaga. Et antud konkreetselt töötamiseks selle tööandja juures. Kui isikul on soov oma tööandjat vahetada elamisloa kehtivuse ajal, siis kogu protsessi tuleb alustada algusest peale. Ehk siis taotleda uuesti elamisluba töötamiseks uue tööandja juurde. Et ma natuke tutvustan meie tiimi, et me nõustame 3 keeles, eesti, inglise ja vene. Meile saab helistada, te näete praegu seda numbrit, iga tööpäev kella 9-st kella 3-ni vastame meeleldi teie telefonikõnedele 3 keeles. Meile saab kirjutada, saates oma e-kirja aadressile migrationadvice@politsei.ee. Me vastame esimesel võimalusel, aga 30-päevase perioodi jooksul. Paraku viimasel ajal on meil nii palju pöördumisi, et tõepoolest vastamistähtaeg võib natuke ka viibida. Meiega on võimalik kohtuda ka Skype'is. Selleks on võimalik saata kirjaliku pöördumise aadressile migrationadvice@politsei.ee ja paluda Skype kohtumist migratsiooninõustajaga. Siis me vastame teile ja pakume konsultatsiooni aja, mis sobiks nii meile kui ka teile. Varsti loodame, et me saame teid isiklikult ka näha, et siis tasapisi hakkame taastama need kontaktkohtumise. Ütleme nii, Tallinnas meiega saab, mina töötan näiteks Tallinnas, meiega saab kohtuda Eesti rahvusvahelises maja Valukoja 8 tänaval. Ja tänaseks on minu poolt kõik. Loodan, et see oli kasulik. Kui teil on küsimusi, siis palun esitage ja vastan meeleldi. Jah, tõepoolest, kui tegemist on ajutise iseloomuga töötamise, mis ei ületa 5 päeva 30-päevase perioodi jooksul, siis selleks ei pea tööandja registreerima lühiajalist töötamist Politsei- ja Piirivalveametist. Aga kindlasti UK kodanikul peab olema kehtiv viibimisalus. Olenemata on see tema viisavabadus, mida saab kogu Schengeni peale, nagu ütlesime, kuni 90 päeva kasutada või näiteks kehtiv viisa. See vastab teile.
Ütlen siin ka omapoolsed tänusõnad, et tänu Harile ja tänu Alinale selle väga põhjaliku ja ülevaatliku ülevaate eest, et väga kasulik teada, et kui me seda infoseminari plaanisime, et siis oli kohe algusest peale mõte, et tutvustame mõlemasuunalisi reeglid ja korraldust, kuna kultuurivahetus on kahesuunaline ja et siis on hea teada, millised on nüüd need uued reeglid. Kas on veel kuulajatel küsimusi? Siin chatis pole praegu rohkem märku antud. Ootame hetke ja kui praegu küsimusi ei tule, et siis tõesti, et ka innustame siit omalt poolt võtma ühendust migratsiooninõustajatega, kuna selline tore teenus on nüüd olemas ja ka mitmeid kanaleid pidi kättesaadav, et kindlasti pöörduda nende poole, kui tekib küsimusi. Aga ma vaatan, et praegu küsimusi ei ole, et siis ma võib-olla veel siin lõpetuseks, et võtame vaikselt oma infoseminari kokku, et lõpetuseks annaksin sõna veel meie kultuuriesindajale Londonis, Kersti Kirsile, kes ütleb ka väikese lõpusõna siia. Kersti, oled sa seal kuuldel?
Tere! Aitäh siit Londoni kesklinnast ka korraldajatele, osalejatele, esinejatele siin tuleb jooksvalt chatis tagasisidet, paistab, et oli kasulik. Ma arvan, et kõigil meil läheb veidikene aega, et orienteeruda nendes lühendite rägastikus, et aru saada, et PPE, PPF, PPA, mis me siin märkisime, T2, T5, LTR, KOS, et see nõuab natukene aega, aga ma usun, et head uudised on siiski need, et kultuurivahetus saab jätkuda ja ehitame siis neid kultuuri- ja spordisildu ikkagi edasi, on võimalusi ka alati viisavabalt tulla lühemalt, mis ma usun, et on siin enamiku teist olukord või tulla lühiajaliselt andma kontserte või etendusi, et jätkame ja ootame teid taas siia, loodetavasti olukord siin varsti paraneb. Täna on küll natukene veel kurbi uudiseid, et lükati edasi meil see suur vabanemine, aga siiski ühel päeval me saame sellest viirusest ka jagu ja siis saame käituda reeglitepäraselt ja kultuurivahetus jätkub. Ja minu poolt siis praegu kõigile palju jõudu ja kaunist suve.
Aitäh Kerstile selle toreda sõnumi eest ja ma arvan, et sellega on hea lõpetada, et siis kõigile jõudu. Head kultuurikoostööd UK ja Eesti vahel ja mina siin ja Kersti UK-s siis ka vastavalt võimalustele ja vajadustele reageerime, kui teil küsimusi on, aga paneme siis kõik tänase infoseminari materjalid ka meie kodulehel ülesse ja siis soovitame sealt uurida ja puurida ja loodetavasti saame koostöös kõik küsimustele lahendused ja vastused ja kultuurikoostöö Eesti ja UK vahel jätkub sama tihedalt nagu varasemalt enne kogu seda pandeemiat. Aitäh kõigile osalemast! Ja nägemist!
Aitäh!
Aitäh!